social science speaker series. We're very, very excited as faculty in the School of Language and Liberal Studies and Social Science to introduce to you our speaker for today, Steph Guthrie. Did I say that right? You did? Yes, awesome. So I just want to give you like a one little liner that does not even represent a little of what she is or who she is or what she does, but I think it's a good way to introduce her to her topic. So Steph is a feminist advocate, organizer, and analyst focusing on the intersections of gender, culture, and technology. So her topic today is drawing new lines in our social sand. She is the founder of the Women in Toronto Politics, and she produces events and online resources to promote more gender-inclusive civic discourse. So, a little round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Speaking of Women in Toronto Politics, actually, you have your own group here in London that is focused on the very same thing called Women in Politics London, so you should totally check them out. They are awesome. Anyway, I am really, really excited to be here today because I'm here to talk about one of the issues that probably matters more to me than almost anything else. So I'm here in a way to talk about cyberbullying. So raise your hands if you've heard the term cyberbullying. Okay, not shocking, not shocking. What do you think of cyberbullying as a term? Anyone have thoughts on it? Yeah.
I would say cyberbullying is not like cyberbullying. It's the nasty, call you nasty me, and gets technology gets you with phone or on Facebook, Twitter, on internet.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all about our behavior on the internet and on our phones. So outside of the behavior itself, what do you guys think of the word cyberbullying? Any thoughts, just off the cuff? Your feelings about the word? Yeah?
That it could also just be called bullying. Wrap it all together.
Yeah, that it could also just be called bullying. Like, why don't we just call it bullying? What is it that's so specific about this place where it takes place? Like, do we differentiate between school bullying and workplace bullying and, you know, audiovisual club bullying? Like, why do we have this specific term for this specific place where bullying happens? And you had a thought as well.
That it could be called harassment in most cases.
It could also be called harassment in most cases. Yes, I agree. I have issues with the term cyberbullying, in case you couldn't tell. Some of those issues are very much what your fellow students have just highlighted, that you know, it refers to bullying that happens at a very specific place, and it doesn't necessarily have to be so specific, and also that a lot of the time it's referring to behaviors that, when given another word, sound much more harmful than bullying, right? And I mean, my chief problem with the term cyberbullying, does that say anything at all about who gets bullied, who does the bullying, what the bullying is focused on? I don't think it does, personally. To me, the word cyberbullying is very, it's devoid of any politics. And I think that that's a problem because a lot of the time, bullying, no matter where it takes place, whether it's online or people like to say in real life, I think our lives online are just as real. I prefer the term meat space, so it's like cyberspace, but meat space, because it's where our, you know, our bodies, our meat, are located. But anyway, what happens online in the phenomenon that we call cyberbullying, it's reproducing the same power dynamics that govern our lives outside of the internet. So the kinds of bullying that we often see, like when I look back on, you know, bullying when I was in school, who got bullied? Well, there was a lot of making fun of girls for their perceived sexual activity. There was a lot of making fun of immigrant students for the food that they ate or things like that, or the clothes that they wore. There was a lot of bullying of low-income students because they wore hand-me-downs and things like that. Now, we're talking about very specific power dynamics here. We're talking about hierarchies of gender. We're talking about hierarchies of immigration status. We're talking about hierarchies of class. So, I mean, bullying, even when it's, you know, young people who are doing it, it's reproducing the same power dynamics that determine, you know, who has power and who doesn't in the rest of our society. So when we call it cyberbullying, we're really choosing to, you know, hide the fact that it's not like everybody gets bullied equally, right? So when I think about this term and how much I strongly dislike it, I think about the fact that this is a relatively new phenomenon, at least the behavior that happens online. And we're in a time right now where we have the potential to develop new terminology for this phenomenon. And I look back to decades ago, and we, once upon a time, we didn't have terminology for the phenomenon of domestic violence. We didn't have terminology for child abuse. We didn't have terminology for sexual harassment in the workplace. These were all things that once upon a time were just considered normal and you know, didn't have a terminology. And I think that the conversation about quote-unquote cyberbullying could benefit from its own terminology that more specifically captures what is actually happening and the harm that's caused. So I would propose the general term online violence. And online violence could be qualified to refer to online gendered violence. It could refer to online racial violence, online homophobic violence. You could qualify it any way you like. But the bottom line is that I would define online violence as the use of interconnectivity, instantaneity, and insulation of the internet and social media to facilitate campaigns of harassment, intimidation, humiliation, emotional distress, and terror against targeted individuals. And oftentimes, these individuals are part of a group that is unduly and disproportionately being treated that same way. So let's talk a little bit about why is online violence a thing? Like, why is this a thing that we have to deal with? And what is it about the internet that facilitates it? Well, there's a number of factors. So the first one, I would say, I would call it social distance. When someone posts an abusive comment about somebody else on Facebook, they don't have to stand there and look them in the face and deal with the impact of their words. They can just, you know, they hit send, and then they can walk away from the computer and, you know, go eat dinner, and generally not have to deal with the consequences of their actions. Because the communication is taking place in a virtual space, it's weird because it physically distances us from the people that we're communicating with, and in some cases, it's easy for people to perceive the people, the subject matter, and in some cases even their own actions as somehow not real because it's happening in a virtual space. But the impact is real. Another feature of online communication that facilitates online violence is instantaneity, which, okay, I don't even know if that's a word. I'm just going to go ahead and make it up right now. But instantaneity, it's like instantaneous, right? It's so fast and so easy to post an abusive comment. So it just brings down the threshold of, it removes some barriers to harassing other people. So once upon a time, you might have to, you know, show up at their doorstep, or dial on a phone, or even mail them a letter, you know, and that takes a lot more effort than typing something into a box and hitting submit. So once upon a time, you know, when you had to go through these extra steps, you had all these extra opportunities to think about, like, do I really want to do this? Like, is this maybe really super harsh what I'm about to do? Should I maybe not do this thing? We don't have those barriers anymore, so you can just go, boom, submit, and it's done. It's also really easy to do it in a high volume because it's so fast and easy. Like, people actually create robots on Twitter where if someone tweets about racism, the robot will tweet something racist back at them. So then it doesn't even have to be a person doing it. They've just programmed a robot to do it. So it's really fast and easy, and that makes it, that just means that it's all the more common. Another feature of online communication that facilitates online violence is echo chambers. So on the internet, we are able to really finely curate and tailor the perspectives that we choose to encounter online. And this can be a great thing in some ways because, like, I don't know if any of you were kind of geeky like me in high school, but like, I was interested in things that not a lot of people in my high school were interested in, and I would sometimes get made fun of for that. But on the internet, which was just, you know, becoming a thing when I was in high school, there were message boards and chat rooms where I could talk to people who shared my interests, and it made me feel a lot less alone. So the fact that you can seek out these like-minded communities can be a really good thing in some ways, but it also has some significant problems because it can box us into this echo chamber where we're surrounded by people who think the exact same things that we do. And even if that viewpoint isn't very common, we are given the perspective that it is common because it's what we're surrounded with. And I think we saw an example of how awry this kind of thing can go last year when that guy, Elliot Rodger, in Isla Vista, California, shot up a sorority house and murdered, what was it, 6 or 7 people because no girls would go out with him. And I don't know if he would have gotten to that point if he hadn't spent a great deal of his time on internet communities that are filled with young men who are feeling similarly disaffected by the fact that women didn't want to go out with them. And it created this kind of toxic stew of like entitlement to women's affection. And I mean, who could say whether he would have done it if those communities had existed or not? You know, I can't say for sure, but I do think that those communities helped to kind of push him to the edge. Some other features of online communication that will make online violence more common. Performance. So think about it. When you comment on Facebook or you type out a tweet, so many people might be watching. You don't know. Could be hundreds of people, right? Especially if it's on Twitter, which is a bit more public than Facebook. So if I'm saying something to you here in this room, the only people who are going to hear it are the people in this room. And of course I'm performing to a certain extent, but like when you're online, you're performing for everybody all the time. And I think that there are a lot of harassers who engage in abusive behavior online, at least partly, to draw a reaction from an audience. And there are online communities that, like 4chan, some of you may have heard of, and 8chan. Performance is a huge part of the rules that govern how these communities interact with each other. And there's this whole kind of dynamic of like, oh yeah, you said that really extreme thing? Well, I'm gonna say this super extreme thing and you can just deal with it. And maybe I don't mean it, you'll never know, but I'm super extreme. And so it can create this kind of game of one-upmanship that's all about performing for each other and impressing each other. Another feature, and I want to be clear about this one because I would say there's a lot of misunderstanding about this feature of online communication. Anonymity. So a lot of people, in my line of work, I encounter people saying all the time, well, everyone should just have to use their real names online. I mean, if that were the case, then nobody would say this kind of stuff. And not only do I not believe that that's true, but there's actual peer-reviewed research backing up the fact that that's not true. So once upon a time in South Korea, they used to have a policy for online commenting where any website that had a significant amount of monthly traffic, like lots of people visiting the website, any website like that had to have real name commenting policies. But they eliminated that when they realized that it was only removing, that policy only resulted in a 1% decrease in the number of abusive and malicious comments. 1%. So I don't think that removing anonymity is a very effective way of removing abusive behavior from our online spheres. And it also can be a real infringement on people's rights. So I would never advocate for removing the right to anonymity online. Imagine if you were fleeing an abusive partner who was going to try and track you down. You would want the right to remain anonymous online, wouldn't you? So it is important. However, the ability to make yourself anonymous online, it does mean that it's harder for people to trace your behavior back to you. So it can make it easier to engage in abusive behavior online without consequences. Which brings me to my final point, that the internet is basically a consequence-free zone. Now, law enforcement's use of the internet is still pretty limited, mainly directed toward piracy, terrorism, and child pornography. I've actually had a police officer ask me how to use email before, so there's quite a lot of misunderstanding about the internet among law enforcement. However, I'm not just talking about state-sanctioned consequences here. I'm talking about just the social consequences of, like, you do something abusive and people saying to you, hey, you know, that's really not cool. Like, I think that's racist, or I think that's misogynistic. You know, those kinds of social consequences where someone says to you, I don't think what you just said was cool, and if you want to continue being friends with me, you're going to have to work on that because I don't like it. You know, those kinds of consequences are not so common online, in large part because we have this, this online credo of don't feed the trolls, which says that if someone says something abusive, just ignore it, right? It's a lot like how we tell kids, you know, just ignore the bully and they'll stop. I don't know, I tried ignoring bullies and it didn't really work. And the other problem with ignoring this kind of behavior is it can give the abusive person the false impression that their ideas and their attitudes are popular. And it can drive good people out of the discourse and end up having the discourse totally dominated by these really abusive personalities. So we don't have to continue letting these people think that their views are popular. That's actually one thing that as internet users, we have the power to change. So I'm sure that, I think that everyone in this room would probably agree that it's not a private, trivial matter if a man decided to beat his partner because she didn't have dinner on the table in time. Or if someone suggested to another person in their office that they would have to perform sexual favors to get a promotion. We probably wouldn't just brush these things off, right? Well, some people would, but I would hope that most of us would not brush these things off. But this is exactly the kind of thing that we say about online violence all the time. People will say things like, it's harmless. It happens the same way for everybody. It affects everyone equally. Or, that's just the way it is. That's just the way the internet is. There's nothing we can do about it. The idea that domestic violence is harmless or inevitable seems pretty ridiculous now, but we used to say those very same things, and we say those things about online violence all the time right now. And I would argue that we don't have to continue saying those things. So online violence, if you're going to say it's harmless, let's talk about what it can actually look like. Online violence, it can be as mild as disparaging remarks about your appearance, your intelligence, your daily activity, or your social worth. Now this might be mild on a one-off, but if you're a person who opens your inbox every day to messages like this, which I do, by the way, it really weighs on you eventually, and it makes you just not want to open your email in the morning, and it can be pretty hard to deal with, and that's the mild end of the spectrum. It can also be threats of violence, rape, and murder. It can also be hacking and theft of your personal information, which actually happened to me 5 minutes before I started doing this talk. It can also be posting of your personal information, including your social insurance number, your address, your name, your telephone number, for anyone to see on the internet. It can be retweeting and reposting to incite further harassment from the abuser's followers. It can be posting of your contact information with calls to rape, assault, or murder the target, or insinuations that the target would like to be assaulted or raped or murdered. It can be the posting of violent, pornographic, photoshopped pictures and video online. It can be the creation of fake email and social media accounts in the person's name, in the target's name. Imagine somebody hacks into your LinkedIn account and replaces your profile picture with a naked picture. It can be the use of those fake accounts to disseminate disparaging information and pictures of the target. It can be use of the fake accounts to attack or harass the loved ones of the target, your friends, your family, your coworkers. The use of the contact information to escalate and start making phone calls, start mailing letters, start showing up on your doorstep. And it can be the use of your work contact info to put your economic position in danger, try and get you fired. It can be stalking or physical attacks, sexual assault and rape, murder or attempted murder, which has happened as a result of online violence. But the thing is, even if you never make physical contact with your stalker or harasser or bully or whatever you want to call it, even if there's never any physical contact, the abuse really takes its toll. I mean, there's the loss of your right to speak freely online. So if we're talking about freedom of speech, let's talk about who's being pushed offline because of this kind of behavior. The loss of your reputation, of your economic opportunities. It can be significant impacts on your mental health, which I can speak to personally. A sense of constant fear, anxiety. You withdraw from your daily activities. You stop taking speaking engagements, which I have done before because people are saying, hey, Steph Guthrie is going to be at this location on this date. Maybe we should all show up. It can be impact on your physical health, like chronic exhaustion, chronic pain, chronic illness. And in some cases, people die by suicide because of this kind of thing. Let's talk about the other myth, another myth, that it happens the same for everybody. In my area of work, I have a lot of skeptics who think, you know, women don't experience this any worse than men do, or people of color don't get this any worse than white people do. But the reality is, like I said earlier, online violence is about power and domination. And it replicates the same systems of power that govern the rest of our lives. So the same people who are marginalized in the world at large are marginalized online too. Let's look at gender just as one example. While, I don't know, research in this area is relatively new. We haven't seen all that much research come out. It's mostly just been since about 2011 that it's been a thing. But women, some research has found that women are 27 times more likely to get sexually explicit and threatening messages online. Also, in another piece of research, 73% of victims of online violence were female. And meanwhile, in terms of who perpetrates the online violence, of course, as I mentioned earlier, many of them do so anonymously, so it's not possible to identify everybody. I'll take questions at the end, but hang on to that. Of the harassers whose gender we know, 61% of them are men. Now that doesn't mean 61% of men engage in this behavior, of course. Not all men. But there is definitely an identifiable dynamic there. So, the thing is, we can choose to change this at any time. Because if we come back to that original question I asked, which is, why is online violence a thing? Why do we have to deal with this? Well, it's a thing because the internet is just us. We are the internet. our views and attitudes are what make up the internet. Not only in that we are the internet users, but we are also the people who create the technologies we use to engage online. Everything about the internet is human at its root. So we can choose to change this dynamic, and we can do that by speaking up. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some strategies that we can use to change this. Anyone ever heard of bystander intervention before? Mostly the teachers, yes. That's good. Good start. So bystander intervention, it is basically just speaking up. And it's a strategy for preventing and discouraging interpersonal violence and bigotry by framing these problems as something that we all have to tackle, that we all have to deal with. So bystander intervention doesn't see it as only the responsibility of the perpetrator and or the target to prevent this kind of behavior. It implicates everyone who's around to witness it happen. It's everyone's responsibility. So I really like this approach for a number of reasons. So basically what it does is it encourages witnesses to speak up when they see something like this happening, to get help if they need to, and to generally support the target of the violence or bigotry. Now, the reasons I love this approach, first of all, it gets rid of that whole victim blaming thing. So instead of saying, you know, that the target needs to just change their behavior, so I mean, if we're talking about rape, it would be the idea that like, oh, well, just don't wear that type of clothing, or don't go to that type of bar, or don't go out alone at night. You know, that's victim blaming. That's putting it on the target of the behavior to change the fact that they might be attacked. And online, how this plays out, I've heard so many people, I've had many people tell me, why don't you just get off the internet? Just don't go online. It's like, are you living in 2015? Like, you're really gonna tell me to just get off the internet? Like, my livelihood is on the internet. My friends are on the internet. It's a big part of a person's life. So bystander intervention gets rid of that whole idea that it's my job to stop myself from being targeted by just getting offline. It also does the wonderful thing of modeling really positive social norms. So everyone who's watching a person intervene in a case of bigotry is getting a blueprint for how they could maybe intervene if they saw something like this happen in the future. So it tells us, it gives us something to aspire to, and honestly, a lot of the time, if you decide to intervene and say, hey, not cool, in one of these circumstances, you are probably not the only person who is uncomfortable with it, okay? There was probably at least a couple of other people who were watching this go down and were super uncomfortable with it, but didn't know what to say or how to intervene, and you intervening has given them the courage. So either they might step up and support you in intervening this time, or in the future, when they see something like this happen, they'll be more likely to step up. And then the other thing I really like about it is that it really shows us that bigotry, whether we're talking, you know, sexism or racism or homophobia or transphobia, these are social problems. These are not the problems of just the people who are really viciously racist and the people who experience racism. It's everyone's problem, because the problem is ideas, right? The problem isn't even necessarily behavior, it's the ideas that drive that behavior. And we all have the power and the responsibility to intervene and challenge those ideas. So, one important thing to remember is that when you even if you decide not to intervene, if you do nothing, you're still doing something. So, there are helpful and harmful ways to act when you see this type of thing go down online or in meet space. Some harmful things that you could do would be obviously to instigate the violence. That is not advised. I don't advise you to instigate the violence. You could also be a person who encourages the violence by, you know, egging the aggressor on, or, you know, laughing about it, or that kind of thing. You could also join in the violence by, you know, backing up the person who's being the aggressor. You could watch silently, or you could ignore it. And these last two are probably the most common types of bystander behavior. And I want you to know that your behavior has an impact when you choose those things too. When you choose to watch something silently or to ignore it, you're giving the person license to continue being a bigot. You're not giving them any incentive to stop. And you're doing, as I suggested earlier, you are doing them a favor by giving them the impression that their views are popular. So, some helpful bystander actions you could take. You could challenge the behavior directly, the whole dude, not cool thing. You could also offer your support to the target of the violence. You could say to them, hey, I saw that go down, that was awful and, you know, really transphobic. I'm so sorry, are you okay? Is there anything I can do? That's intervening as well. So, there are some things that I would suggest you avoid if you're going to intervene in a situation of bigotry or interpersonal violence. Don't meet violence with violence. And this can be a challenge. Like, I have a lot of really awesome guy friends who, when they see something sexist happening on the internet, they really want to step in and do something about it, which I love, and I really encourage them. But sometimes, because the way that they're taught how to kind of be a man in this world teaches them that they should be really dominant and aggressive, when they choose to intervene in these situations, they will often just replicate the same harmful, sexist ideas that the initial aggressor was propagating. So an example of that would be like, say I'm being harassed by a misogynist on the internet, and my guy friend steps in and he says, oh, hey, why don't you stop that? You're such a pussy. You probably live in your mother's basement eating Cheetos. Like, that basically reinforces the same, you know, it insults him by referring to a female body part. And it says, oh, well, you're not a real man, you're a mama's boy. So it's a sexist way of intervening, and it kind of reinforces that same violent attitude that drove the person to attack me in the first place. So you want to be careful not to replicate the violence. And obviously, if it's a situation where you're intervening in person and it could be a physically violent situation, you want to be very careful that you're not exposing yourself or anyone else to the potential of physical violence. And then finally, it's really important to follow the target's lead. So sometimes you can intervene in a way that just makes things worse for the target. So, for example, sometimes I've been attacked online, and I deal with it, and then a few hours go by and I haven't heard anything from the person who attacked me. But then a friend sees it all happen, and they come storming in and they're like, oh, how dare you have done that to Steph? But it's like 3 hours later and nothing has happened, and I was just happy to like not have to deal with this horrible person anymore, and now the whole situation is kicked back up again and I have to deal with it again. So if need be, sometimes it can be helpful to check in with the target, to ask them privately, like, hey, I was thinking of intervening and saying blah, blah, blah. Would that be helpful to you, or would you prefer something else? So when in doubt, check in with the target. And then I also want you to think about the fact that you don't want to be doing this for a pat on the back. You don't want to be intervening because you want to be a hero, you want everyone to think you're such a great person. Don't do it for the cookies. Do it because it's like the bare minimum standard of being a good human being and building a better world is to challenge ideas that are harmful and replace them with more positive ideas. So you're not being a hero, you're just being a human. Keep that in mind. And then finally, don't only intervene in like the most vicious, extreme cases of bigotry. Like, not every instance of racism involves the N-word. Not every instance of misogyny involves the C-word. Sometimes racism can be, it can be more subtle than that. It can be like a person expressing fear when they walk by a group of black men. Or it could be someone dismissing a woman's totally valid frustration and anger as crazy or hysterical or irrational. You know, these things operate in subtle ways too, and we need to learn to recognize all of these things as unacceptable because they're all connected. And the more quote-unquote mild instances of this sort of thing, when those messages add up over time, what it does is it justifies the people who commit the more extreme or physically violent acts of bigotry are doing it because they've received all these milder messages throughout their life justifying that behavior and telling them this type of person is lesser than, this type of person is an appropriate vector for my aggression. So you have to intervene in these milder forms of bigotry because they feed the larger and more physically violent expressions of racism, misogyny, homophobia. And if we want to prevent these larger instances, we have to starve the beast of those attitudes by challenging those smaller instances too. And the more we have these conversations with each other, the more we challenge bigotry and inspire others to challenge it too, the more we are depriving hatred of the oxygen it needs to thrive, to grow, and to replicate. So let's starve the beast. If you want to build a better world, you got to speak up for it. Thanks, everyone.